Good morning. My name's Melanie Hughes, Director of Sustainable Development Programme in Natural England, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second part of today's conference, Achieving a Healthy Green Recovery, the Essential Role of Green Infrastructure. So I participated in the first webinar today, and I think many of us have, which raised some really interesting discussions around the role of green infrastructure in a healthy green recovery, and we can continue some of those discussions through this session too. This conference has been jointly organised by Natural England and the TCPA on behalf of the Green Infrastructure Partnership. The Green Infrastructure Partnership is a national network of people and organisations working to achieve high quality green infrastructure, and it's free to join. That has been made possible by the generous support of a number of sponsors. Natural England, the TCPA and the Green Infrastructure Partnership sponsors have provided a wider range of free materials for you to look at and download in the Expo booth. So if you look to the left of your screen, there's a tab at the left called Expo, which you can click into. We'll be live tweeting from this event and hope you'll join us in that using the hashtags you can see on the screen there, GreenInf21 and Green Recovery. The conference is being recorded and available via the TCPA's website in a few days' time, but as delegates, you will also be sent a link to this webpage. So on to this session, which is about biodiversity and environmental net gain, opportunities for delivering green infrastructure. Many of you will be aware through the Environment Bill that biodiversity net gain will be mandated for housing in the next 2 years. So Royal Assent is likely, so 2 years after Royal Assent, so 2023. And there's also been an amendment to include nationally significant infrastructure projects too, though the timetable is slightly less clear. And just a quick plug for the first of the tools that enable that, which are being launched tomorrow, the Biodiversity Net Gain Metric and the Environmental Benefits from Nature tools. So although biodiversity net gain is being driven by nature recovery, there is a huge wealth of opportunity to maximise the benefits that can be achieved from that, and in particular for people and places in the form of green infrastructure. So this next session seeks to explore that from several perspectives with 4 very interesting speakers. We won't take questions after each presentation, we'll just run through the 4 presenters, but there'll be time at the end with the speakers on a panel. But we do want to capture your questions as we go through. So if you post them on the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen under the stage tab, as you think of them, we'll pick those up. You can also upvote the questions that you most want answered. That makes it easier for us to find them. We will be capturing all questions and responding to them in due course. So, without further ado, I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Nick White, a colleague of mine in Natural England, who's going to talk about making the most of biodiversity net gain. Nick leads the work on biodiversity net gain in Natural England. He's a long-standing interest in green infrastructure and is a strong believer in the ability of net gain to help finance and deliver more and better quality GI that benefits nature and people. Over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Mel, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning and welcome everybody. So as Mel said, my name is Nick White, Net Gain Lead in Natural England, and I just wanted to talk about the links between biodiversity net gain and green infrastructure in particular. So move on to the next slide, please, Jessie. So firstly, we see net gain as really a transformational opportunity. It's a fantastic opportunity to benefit, not just as it's says on the teacher, but also to deliver benefits to people and places to really help improve the quality of the built environment where we live and work, but also to improve the functioning of the economy as well, to help make the planning process smoother, more straightforward, and to achieve that kind of triple win, if you like, for nature, people and place and economy. So a real opportunity here with net gain. Next slide, please. I like to try and think of things in a fairly simplistic manner. So why is it net gain is so important? Using the power of Lego to try and illustrate that. So in the top example, we've got some area of nature that's been lost to a development, in this case, a block of flats. That's quite common close to where I live in parts of southeast London. And the nature's gone, so there's been a net loss. The important thing to emphasise, though, is that that development has been entirely legal. It's done nothing wrong. It may have met its protected species and other requirements, but overall it's led to a loss in the kind of nature that was there beforehand. we're looking to reverse that fundamentally and say, actually, that's not good enough. It won't address both the kind of nature emergency, but also some of the kind of wider benefits we know nature can deliver for people. And so it's looking to leave a positive outcome from that development for nature. So it's leaving more nature than was there at the outset. So it's a real transformational change, I think. Next slide, please. It's also important to emphasise that actually it's perfectly possible to deliver net gain now. So within the existing national planning policy framework, which was recently updated together with the planning practice guidance, it's already set out an ability for local authorities to require biodiversity net gain from developments in their area. And many far-sighted developers are actually doing it anyway, so it isn't new. It's also something that's been referenced and recognised in the National Design Guide and in the recent National Infrastructure Strategy as well. And then moving through to the next slide, please. It's also embedded in the National Emissions Design Principles, which talk about projects looking to deliver a net gain in biodiversity that contribute to the restoration of wildlife, etc. And then there's soon to be a British standard on biodiversity net gain, which is coming out imminently, which is a process standard. And then lastly, the work underway on green infrastructure standards and the framework for that, again, kind of fits with biodiversity net gain approach. So there are existing drivers and the existing reasons as to why to enable net gain to be delivered and to support that. But the real kind of emphasis at the moment is on the Environment Bill, as Mel mentioned. So next slide, please. So what this bill does, it introduces a mandatory biodiversity net gain requirement, and it does that by amending both the Town and Country Planning Act, so it will apply to all Town and Country Planning Act projects, and then significantly, it's also just been extended to include nationally significant infrastructure projects as well. It's all developments down to mean low water, and it requires them all to achieve a minimum 10% biodiversity net gain as calculated using a biodiversity net metric and submission of a net gain plan. The TCPA schemes will all be required to secure habitat for at least 30 years, and there's three mechanisms for achieving net gain. Firstly, on-site. Secondly, off-site through third-party landowners, and then equally, if that's not available, through the purchase of statutory biodiversity credits, and I'll talk about those a little bit shortly. It also establishes a national register for net gain sites, so any land that's being used for the purposes of delivering net gain will go onto that register. And for TCPA schemes, this net gain requirement is likely to become law by the second half of 2023. The timetable for NSIPs is at present slightly waiting clarification. The amendment's only just gone in, but the TCPA schemes, it will be by 2023. The important thing to stress as well is it doesn't change existing legal protections. So it doesn't kind of weaken any existing protections around protected species, protected sites, for example. And although the bill doesn't apply to marine net gain, separate work is underway to extend the approach to marine developments as well. Next slide, please. One thing to emphasise is, although the bill is now kind of quite well progressing through Parliament, so it's currently in the House of Lords, there is still a lot of detail to be set out. So there will be a forthcoming consultation on associated secondary legislation and regulations relating to net gain. And do watch out for those. We are expecting them in the next few months as a consultation. It will run for a 3-month period of time. And it will include details such as the nature of the net gain plan that developers need to submit, any exemptions to the net gain requirements, how it deals with phased developments, what constitutes habitats, etc. It'll also address questions such as whether net gain sales can be combined with the sales of other ecological benefits such as carbon or nitrates, and a bit more detail around the credits and the register scheme. So do watch out for this consultation and please do engage with it. It's an important consultation when it comes. Next slide, please. There are two additional components of the Environment Bill that I want to draw your attention to, though, because they have particular bearing when it comes to how net gain can work and it's expected to work and be delivered in practice. The first is the establishment of local nature recovery strategies. So these are being set up across England. They're locally developed spatial strategies for nature that operate within a kind of national framework. There's likely to be about 50 of these, and what they'll do is they'll identify opportunities and priorities at a local level for enhancing and creating additional habitats, so enhancing existing, creating additional habitats. There will be the mechanism that informs and underpins the National Nature Recovery Network. But from a net gain perspective, their real importance comes in the fact that you can use what they say by way of either the habitats that they include within their descriptors or within the mapping to really begin to target where you would like to see and how you would like to see net gain being delivered in your local area as well. And the metric will reward developments that deliver in accordance with the priorities that have been set out in local nature recovery strategies, or if a strategy hasn't been adopted in an equivalent strategy, such as a green infrastructure strategy. The other element of the bill that's important is conservation covenants. So the bill requires that habitats are secured for a minimum of 30 years. Where people are happy to go beyond that, then there's a mechanism being established called conservation covenants, which are voluntary, but they do allow for the net gain to be secured potentially out into perpetuity if the landowner is happy to do that. So again, that could be another mechanism biodiversity net gain, in addition to the planning obligations, which should secure for the minimum of 30 years. So two other important elements of the bill. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's three mechanisms for delivering biodiversity net gain. In the first instance, it's delivering on-site, and the bill actually encourages the exploration of on-site opportunities first before looking to the other opportunities. And this could be done through enhanced habitat creation or habitat enhancement through landscaping, green infrastructure, obviously, and the like. And there really are significant opportunities to do that, particularly where sites have got a low biodiversity baseline, and the expectation then would often be that the net gain could be fully achieved within the site. However, there'll always be instances where that's not possible, or where it's not appropriate. So if you've got certain types of habitats where actually it wouldn't work for them to try and squeeze them onto a small site, or equally the nature of the development itself may mean that on-site delivery is not possible, then the developer can go off-site and contract with third-party landowners to deliver that net gain. That could be through land that's owned by local planning authorities, it could be NGOs, it could be local farmers, anyone with land that's had that land on the net gain register would be able to do that. And then lastly, to make sure no development ever gets stuck, so to make sure if there's a situation where the developer is unable to deliver net gain on their site, if they cannot identify someone off-site to deliver them net gain who's appropriate, the developer can then purchase statutory credits from government. This won't come into force until net gain becomes a legal requirement in 23, but these are really there to deliver some of the more niche habitats and intending to create kind of landscape scale strategic outcomes as well. As I said, the emphasis in the first place will be on on-site and off-site, and then statutory credits only where needed. Next slide, please. So the timetable for net gain is set out on this slide. It is an indicative. A lot has changed over the past 18 months, principally due to COVID, but the bill was introduced in January. As Mel mentioned, the metric that's underpinning net gain is about to be released. There's announcements about that tomorrow. And then this summer / autumn, we'll be expecting a consultation on secondary legislation, with the bill itself achieving royal assent probably towards the end of the autumn period. In the meantime, there'll be the rollout of the local nature recovery strategies, the national register that I mentioned, and also the sales platform for the credits will come on stream probably towards the winter time of the end of 22, early 23. All of this with a view to biodiversity net gain becoming a legal requirement for Town and Country Planning Act developments from the autumn of 23 onwards. Next slide, please. I mentioned that much of this is underpinned by the biodiversity metric. So we're about to release biodiversity metric 3, which will replace the beta version of metric 2, which many of you may be familiar with. It's been downloaded over about 20,000 times now. And it uses habitat features as a proxy measure for wider biodiversity. So it doesn't include species, but it does include everything from an urban street tree, a green roof, green wall, all the way through to high distinctive habitats. And it translates everything into a language of biodiversity units. You can use it for all terrestrial and intertidal habitat types, as well as linear ones, to include rivers and streams, lines of trees, hedgerows, for example. And it basically needs 4 pieces of information to be able to power it. You need to know the size of the habitats you're dealing with, their condition, how distinctive they are, so how important are the habitats, and then lastly, where are they, their kind of location. And when metric 3 comes out, it will also come out with an ability to import GIS data directly into it. Next slide, please. So the metric is really important to NetGain. What it does, it delivers the measurable aspects. So it's there to provide a calculation for the baseline of the site and then forecast what the future NetGain outcome is likely to be. It's designed to provide confidence and ensure consistency of approach. Everyone will be using the same metric. It's underpinned by evidence, but it's been developed so that it's simple yet sound. So it needs to be understood and by planners as well as ecologists and members of the public. So it's been designed to try and be as simple to use and understand as possible. Next slide, please. And it can be applied in a huge range of applications as well. So everything from very small urban schemes, such as a SUD scheme or green wall, right through to garden towns and villages, major infrastructure projects, and all the way down to the coast. It's also the metric that people will be using who are looking to sell biodiversity units to developers from their own land. That could include planning authorities looking to use their own parks or green spaces or other assets to help others deliver their net gain on. So I would encourage people to gain familiarity with the metric. Next slide, please. I also wanted just to highlight a few questions that do often crop up about the relationship between net gain and blue and green infrastructure. So firstly, can GI be used to deliver net gain? Yes, it can, both on-site and off-site, and it will need ultimately to be registered, but absolutely you can use net gain to deliver it. Equally, can parks and green spaces be used? And has been a question whether changes to the NERC duty cause any issues for local authorities for that. Yes, you can use that land. You're perfectly entitled to do that. And the changes to the NERC requirement don't change that either. So yes, you can use your own land to that effect. You could also use other linear infrastructure that local authorities may in control of, such as the roads network and the kind of soft estate along that. And there are some really good examples of how nature has been enhanced by enhancing the kind of soft estate along road networks. It can also be applied to small development sites, and there is a specific simplified metric, again, that's being released that's designed to help calculate net gain for smaller development sites. Next slide, please. And then a few just key considerations for net gain. So firstly, the role of the planning authority is quite key in all of this. So they are the consenting body, they're the decision maker. So be thinking for planning authorities to be thinking now about the opportunities to take forward net gain already without necessarily waiting for the bill through local plans or updated SPDs. Do refer to some of the guidance that's out there. So there's guidance published by the likes of Sirius, IMO, investment going in the natural environment and linking that into local nature recovery strategies or use existing GI strategies or the like in the absence of an NNRS. And also think about how net gain can link to other plans. So how can it help contribute towards health and well-being and other kind of local priorities? As I mentioned, think about your own land holdings and the opportunities to deliver net gain onto those and gain familiarity with the metric and begin to think about what type of reporting requirements you'd like to see from net gain. And then next slide, please. And then lastly, just to go beyond biodiversity net gains, this has all been focused on biodiversity. The 25-year plan set out a longer term ambition around environmental net gain. And that's very much what we would like to see as Natural England as well as others. So we are releasing an environmental benefits from nature tool, which complements the biodiversity metric. It's free to use. You don't have to use it, but what it does do is it enables you to track change across 18 different ecosystem services as well. So it could be a useful tool, particularly if you're wanting to see how can your biodiversity net gain outcomes be delivered in a way that achieve best bang for buck. That's it for me. So thank you very much. I shall hand you back to Mel.
Thanks very much, Nick. I think you've given us a really thorough overview there of what net gain is, how we can start considering it, particularly in local places now. And thanks for flagging the consultation, which will be coming out in the autumn, we expect. I'll move on to the second speaker. I'd like to introduce Krista Patrick, who's going to talk about the local authority strategic planning and delivery side of things. Krista's over 20 years experience of working as an environmental planner in the public, private and community sectors, and joined the Greater Manchester Combined Authority as Natural Capital Co-ordinator in 2016. In this role, Krista provides strategic support on delivering a natural capital approach as part of the Natural Course EU Life integrated project and the Greater Manchester Natural Capital Group. Thank you, Krista. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Mel. And I'm just checking everyone can hear me and see me okay. And if we can go on to the first slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, over the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to provide a bit of an overview really of how we've been applying a natural capital approach to recovering nature in Greater Manchester, and particularly how we've been bringing elements of green infrastructure, biodiversity net gain and nature-based solutions all together, because importantly, they're all interconnected and they all kind of feed off each other. So next slide, please. So I think it's a good way of following on from Nick's overview really about, and particularly the last slide, in terms of how we're looking at kind of applying a wider approach to environmental net gain, and particularly making the most of biodiversity net gain really. So I wanted to build on that concept of natural capital and the ecosystem services that flow from it really. So clean air, water, land, and from my point of view, you know, natural capital, green infrastructure, nature-based solutions are all interconnected. And I think the government's 25-year environment plan, the UK industrial strategy and clean growth strategy all recognise their dependency on each other. And recent government response to the Natural Capital Committee, you know, kind of recognises that urgent action is now required to meet the 25-year environment plan ambitions. And I think, you know, maintaining biodiversity is an essential for maintaining the scale and resilience of ecosystem service delivery. Delivering biodiversity net gain not only enhances biodiversity, but also provides the wider benefits in terms of our kind of natural capital, particularly around carbon capture, flood risk management and recreational space, not to mention all the other benefits that we've already talked about today, particularly around health and well-being. Next slide, please. Thank you. So last year, we completed delivery of the Urban Pioneer project in Greater Manchester, and that was one of 4 areas in the country designed to support and inform the development of the government's natural capital approach in its 25-year environment plan. And as part of the Pioneer, we've been developing new models to manage and improve our environment. And whilst the Urban Pioneer project is finished now, we continue to build on this work and deliver our ambitions for our natural environment. And I think, you know, particularly in terms of all of the components that are shown on this slide, really, in terms of how all this fits together is absolutely key. So it's not just a list of projects that were delivered, but how they're all pulled together by a number of our key partnerships and delivery bodies and headline activities into a comprehensive and targeted programme of activity. So we're bringing together lots of innovative strands there to actually kind of look at how we deliver this on the ground, but also about sharing the learning and helping everyone make better decisions to protect and improve the environment. So whilst we've been doing a lot of work there, what we want to ensure is that the learning is cascaded wider. And next slide, please. And I think that's really, in terms of, you know, kind of going on to, you know, how, you know, it's important to note that this doesn't happen overnight. And we've been on a journey of building political and stakeholder ambition, particularly as well as setting strategic direction. So I think the previous slide, in terms of all the different projects we've been delivering as part of the Urban Pioneer, this just shows the timeline really that we've been on and the journey that we've been on, from building political and stakeholder, you know, support, particularly in terms of, you know, kind of understanding, you know, what we have in terms of our natural environment, but also getting those commitments at a key level, at a leader level, particularly in terms of mayoral commitment to a GM Green City and setting up, you know, kind of the 5-year environment plan, and also kind of going from that strategic planning up to kind of actually now implementation and setting up new delivery models. And next slide, please. And I think obviously one of the key things from our point of view is around the evidence base. And obviously a key priority at the start of the Urban Pioneer was the development of a set of natural capital accounts and ecosystem services opportunity maps. And really, kind of these aim to measure the benefits provided by the city region's natural assets, to whether it's, kind of businesses, public services, or those that we just call, Greater Manchester home. We've done this so that we know what we currently have and can monitor those natural assets over time, seeking improvement. And that's absolutely fundamental, because we know what we've got and we know what we need to do in terms of improving on that. But also we know what we could potentially lose, and therefore what do we need to prioritize in terms of maintaining, enhancing and improving our existing natural environment. And I think, having these tools available provides decision makers at all levels really with the evidence to make informed and joined up decisions. Again, it's making the invisible visible, and it's being able to embed that evidence within everyday decision making, and the way in which you present that information, in which way that the benefits can be communicated to a range of audiences and different sectors in the language that they understand. So whether or not you're talking to healthcare professionals, whether or not you're talking to kind of highways developers, or whether or not you're talking to green space managers or parks managers, there's a range of different ways in which you can communicate the benefits from our natural environment. And since then, a range of natural capital tools have been developed, and obviously we'll hear more in terms of the tools that are being developed at a national level. And I think we've, kind of recently produced our own natural capital user guide for Greater Manchester that actually provides a one-stop shop for all the kind of tools that we produced at a local level in Greater Manchester that can be applied and used by our decision makers. And again, cross references to national tools as well, so they can all be used as part of a package really that can help, kind of make those kind of wider decision making. Next slide, please. And as with all our areas, whether that's in Greater Manchester, the UK or beyond, we all face major environmental challenges that threaten the future health and prosperity of our regions, and particularly with dangerous levels of pollution, degradation of priority habitats and increasing risks of climate change. And in response to these challenges, the Greater Manchester Mayor, Andy Burnham, launched the 5-year environment plan for the city region and had an ambitious vision for a clean, carbon neutral, climate resilient city region with a thriving natural environment, and demanded urgent action to achieve this. And I think by setting, a carbon neutrality target of 2038, there's been a clear ambition there in terms of, but also a clear pathway in terms of, we've been working with University of Manchester and the Tyndall Centre to actually understand what that pathway is to achieve carbon neutrality. So it's not just about carbon, it's about adaptation, it's about resilience. And it therefore kind of encompasses a whole range of measures that we need to be looking at implementing so that we can achieve that carbon neutrality goal by 2038. And I think from our point of view, a lot of the work that we've been delivering on natural capital has helped to shape those priorities in the 5-year environment plan, particularly around the role of the natural environment. And ultimately, we do want to achieve measurable improvements in our environment, particularly around environmental net gain. And I think particularly with our kind of refreshed and new strategies that are coming up, we want to place nature at the heart of those, whether that's the Greater Manchester strategy, the Places for Everyone joint development plan, and new funding opportunities that come forward. Next slide. So this next slide really just provides a bit of an overview really of the kind of 5 priorities that we've been focusing on in the 5-year environment plan, whether or not that's in terms of land, water, biodiversity net gain, but also, the 2 key enablers that make this happen is around finance and funding. Increasing investment, particularly from non-public sources. We've heard a lot today already around, kind of decreasing public budgets, and, how do we resource all of this? And again, how are we looking at, kind of merging and blending public and non-public finances together, and kind of moving away from that traditionally funded public money kind of projects to actually looking at a blended approach. And how do we do that innovatively? But also engagement. People are valuing the natural environment much more and benefiting from it. So, how do we communicate that value that we derive from it? So I'll just take you through a couple of those priorities. So next slide, please. So particularly around managing our land more sustainably. We've already heard about local nature recovery strategies, and Greater Manchester Combined Authority recently published its draft local nature recovery strategy pilot. It's one of 5 pilot areas across England tasked with working with government to develop these strategies. The local nature recovery strategy sets out the priorities for nature's recovery, targeting biodiversity net gain and other investment for nature and other environmental benefits. But at the moment, it doesn't have formal status like documents such as the 5-year environment plan. This is because, until nationally under the Environment Bill becomes law, it won't have that formal status. But that doesn't mean that we can't, and particularly before the Environment Bill becomes law and any other planning reforms come forward, we can still use that local nature recovery strategy to help planning authorities deliver on existing commitments in the NPPF relating to habitat conservation and restoration. And again, it's another piece of evidence that can help planning authorities continue in their role in balancing those kind of competing pressures for land in their areas, helping to look at priority areas where we can achieve more connected opportunities in terms of connecting up our natural environment, and actually kind of delivering, kind of those wider benefits there. So again, we've got illustrations there in terms of our nature recovery network in Greater Manchester, particularly the habitat priority areas that we want to, kind of focus on in terms of managing that kind of demand in future. Next slide. But again, as we've already said, it's about green as well as blue infrastructure. And so, my role is actually funded through the EU Life Integrated Natural Course Project, which is a 10-year integrated project looking at identifying and understanding innovative and cost-effective solutions to a range of water management issues, and where possible, use a natural capital approach to help deliver multiple objectives. So in Greater Manchester, the big challenges we face around water quality, reduce flood risk and enhance biodiversity, considers shared problems requiring shared solutions. So we work with Natural England, the Rivers Trust, our Environment Agency, and United Utilities, our water provider, in terms of actually looking at how we can work better together in terms of that, and actually how can we realise the solutions and the mechanisms and financial instruments that kind of underpin all this. And biodiversity net gain is a great example in terms of how do we look to achieve that. And again, it's great to see, particularly in terms of all the initiatives that are coming forward, and we need to work with developers and businesses to ensure that we get the right solutions in the right places. Next slide. And importantly, around finance, and particularly in anticipation of mandatory biodiversity net gain, we've been working with Natural England and all 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester to understand the opportunities that this brings, and have a plans that we get a head start before this comes into force over the next couple of years. So we've developed guidance for the local authorities, and we've also kind of developed these process maps in terms of actually just having a clear understanding of the roles here, in terms of developer roles, in terms of local planning authority roles, but also in terms of ourselves and our ecology unit, in terms of who does what and at what point along the chain do things need to go to, and those decisions are made. And I think from our point of view, in having that clarity, again, we know the known knowns, but there's lots of known unknowns. And again, as Nick said, there's kind of further consultation happening in terms of, kind of looking at the kind of more detailed aspects of delivery. But from our point of view, having some clear understanding of the known knowns in terms of what we can deliver at the moment provides that kind of clarity that local authorities are looking for in the interim period. And again, we've been working with kind of Natural England colleagues and other experts in the field to actually develop that as a kind of joint kind of document, really, in terms of ensuring that we're working together and understanding what's coming forward in terms of the Environment Bill. And then next slide. And again, finance, we're all reliant on funding to make things happen on the ground. And the natural environment, does remain underfunded, and local authority budgets to maintain and enhance parks and green spaces, as we've seen in the chat, continues to come under pressure. And so how do we address that? And from our point of view, we've been working to secure public and private funding in our natural environment. And, we're very excited that we've recently partnered up with Lancashire Wildlife Trust and set up the Greater Manchester Environment Fund. So we've already, in the last 6 months, through that Environment Fund, brought in £2 million worth of funding to deliver projects on the ground. And over time, we want to grow that fund to deliver more. And we want to work with forward-thinking businesses in Greater Manchester who want to make a positive impact on the city, region, environment. And as part of that Environment Fund, we're developing a proposed habitat bank facility that will build on the momentum of national policy and help deliver biodiversity net gain. Next slide. And again, as I've mentioned, nature-based solutions are a key aspect of this. So through the £4 million Ignition project, we've been developing the case for investment in nature-based solutions in our towns and cities to help reduce the risk from increased flooding through climate change. And as part of our Natural Capital Group conference last month, we launched the Living Lab at the University of Salford, which showcases the benefits of green walls, green roofs, sustainable drainage to help adapt to our urban areas to climate change. And the data and experience of that Living Lab will help build the case for future investment in these solutions in the longer term. So have a look at that in terms of the Ignition project and the Living Lab. There's a kind of live feed there, and they've actually got their own website now. So last two slides, please. So again, as we've already realised, in terms of the pandemic has exposed inequalities in society, those who live in poor environments are also those who have the worst health and lowest incomes and access to high quality green and blue space. So how do we actually create those and connect those people with our green and blue spaces, but also support new local jobs and benefit health and well-being? And I think that's, from our point of view, particularly the case of the opening of the new RHS Bridgewater in Salford last month is a huge new asset for the city region. The Northern Roots project in Oldham is creating the UK's largest urban farm and eco park on 160 acres of stunning green space, 5 minutes from Oldham town centre. And towards the start of the year, the GM Health and Social Care Partnership was successful in securing £500,000 of funding to deliver green social prescribing activities. So these projects will help connect people with nature-based activities, food growing, community gardening, tree planting, etc. And we want to use this funding to scale up this offer. Last slide. And lastly, really, despite all these challenges, lots been achieved over the past couple of years. And in terms of what next, it's a really exciting time to be working on this agenda. And, particularly Mayor Andy Burnham has put nature as part of his priorities for delivering on this agenda in Greater Manchester, particularly around delivering on the local nature recovery strategy, setting up a green spaces fund, increasing the amount of and quality of accessible rich green space, particularly for our poorest residents, but also appointing a natural environment champion. And I think moving on to the next speakers now, our next stage in terms of the biodiversity net gain journey is about implementation and actually how do we support biodiversity net gain on the ground, and particularly looking at, delivering on that and looking at those investment opportunities that we've discussed already around that. So that's the end of my slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Krista. I think that was a fabulous insight into the environmental ambitions of Greater Manchester, which are very impressive, but how you're using all the initiatives together in a place. Good to hear your mentions of natural capital and the evidence you've got around that, and investment. And like you, I can see lots of questions coming up in the chat about how we fund all these ambitions as well. So thanks very much for that, Krista. We'll move on speakers now to James Scott, and hear from the developer's perspective. James is a founder member of Master Developer Urban and Civic and heads up their approach to strategy and planning. Thank you, James.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come along and give a developer's perspective. So I'm going to kick off by sort of introducing Urban and Civic and the Master Developer approach, because it is the key differential for us is that we are looking at scale. Next slide, please. When, as a master developer, what we are doing is we are taking very large areas of land, we are working them through the planning system, we are then delivering the green, the grey and the community infrastructure in order to create the place into which our customers, the house builders, then deliver houses into serviced parcels. So that range of activity it's more than land promotion, it's into the delivery and the placemaking. And our involvement will stay on a large scale site right the way through delivery, which can be up to 20, 25 years, depending upon the size and the scale of the site. Therefore, when we look at biodiversity and when we look at a whole range of factors that feed into placemaking and placemaking characteristics, that element of scale and longevity is fundamental to the mindset that we are adopting. Next slide, please. And it's more than just homes. So everybody focuses in on the housing number, but with that number of consented and submitted homes across a range of our sites come the delivery of on-site around 53 kilometres of roads, footpaths and cycleways, significant quantums of employment floor space, and significant education delivery as well in the form of primary schools and secondary schools, and we get actively involved in the delivery and the ongoing management of those schools. And I'll come back to that at the end, if I may, because we heard from the earlier session about the importance of education, and this is where actually as a master developer we're already having to stitch these various different pieces together in order to make the place, and also to make sure people understand the long-term management and importance of all the elements that go into it at the outset. But 2,000 acres of open space, that will be what we are the custodians of in terms of delivering just within our sites. And therefore you can see why green infrastructure and biodiversity are such a fundamental element of our thought process already, and why we welcome the changes and the evolutions that are coming forward in the form of the legislative change, and then also in terms of the standardization of guidance. Next slide, please. Planning for large sites is slightly different than planning for smaller sites. And I put this slide up only to sort of emphasize that we operate at a number of layers in terms of, or tiers, as we are bringing forward a site. An outline for, let's say, 5,000 homes and 3 million square feet of employment floor space, such as Alconbury, or 6,000 homes plus at Halton in Rugby. At the outline stage, you have to adopt a principled-based approach. Because if you get too wedded into the detail at the outline, either you make a whole load of promises that need to evolve and change and improve over the lifetime of the scheme, or you never get the planning consent sorted in the first place because you're just trying to nail down too much detail at that very outline stage. But that's not to say the detail isn't important. It's not to say that we don't want that detail to be approved and reviewed and decided upon. And that's why we work heavily in the context of key phases. And a key phase would be down to about 1,000 units on a large-scale scheme. And within a key phase, we bring forward the design codes and the landscape frameworks that help us determine and structure the interplay of place in terms of the green corridors, the development parcels, and I'm going to come on to that in a little bit more detail. And then within that hierarchy of structure, you then have the reserve matters applications coming forward for the delivery of all of those different elements. And they'll be brought forward by a range of different people. As master developer, we'll bring forward the green infrastructure and the grey infrastructure. The house builders, we bring forward the homes. Community buildings, it might be us, it might be a county council, primary schools, the secondary schools, again, it might be us or it might be the county council. So everybody's operating in that hierarchy of structure. And the reason that's important is it gives us that framework into which green infrastructure and biodiversity net gain can play such a fundamentally important role. Next slide, please. And this goes to the point, which is that in all of our design codes on a key phase by key phase, and probably over the lifetime of the 6 schemes that we've got in delivery at the moment, of the 11 schemes we've got overall, we'll be bringing forward around 30 or so design codes. And you can see here that the design code index is on the right-hand side, and the first chapter of that design code index, which we've adopted right from 2012, 2013, when we were bringing forward our first site, is green infrastructure, because it has to be the green infrastructure being thought about first in terms of the structures, the natures, and the natural pathways into which other elements then work. And green infrastructure for us plays more than the role of just biodiversity. You've heard from Krista earlier, but I mean, and others, that amenity, placemaking are also hugely important factors. And if you go to the next slide, you can then also see that when we're delivering at scale, we are making a significant impact. So small decisions have a huge impact. Across our sites to date, we've planted now over 136,000 trees. We've remediated significantly more now than 154 hectares of land. These were accurate figures at about 2019. And we're embedding sustainable forms of transport into those green corridors and through those green corridors as well. Next slide. And you've heard a lot about the impact of lockdown. I mean, it is absolutely true. When we talk to our residents on our sites and we talk to a range of stakeholders around our sites, the green spaces that are provided on these sites are essential. The fact that they have remained open throughout the pandemic is also fundamental. People on the right-hand side, you've just got 2 sample posts from Instagram from our residents living on site. The delight of being able to take an evening walk at the bottom, and the observance of nature and the appreciation of nature, so that we even have our own hashtag at Halton, which is, Halton Nature, which local residents are tagging as they go around and enjoying the sites. Next slide, please. So we started with a design code approach, but as we've got more sophisticated in the way in which we are bringing forward large-scale sites, and as biodiversity has become more and more of a key element for us in understanding what we've sought to do is that we've sought to bring forward our own biodiversity toolkit that we can, which is in advanced development at the moment, and we should be sort of releasing this to the team relatively shortly. But this idea of a structured approach to the consideration of biodiversity in the context of large site delivery. So this sort of very simple strategic design and assessment, coding, detailed design as you move through the planning process that I've just talked about. Biodiversity guardianship, that's the delivery of the green spaces by the master developer as part of the overall delivery of the site. And then a point that came up time and time again, but this biodiversity stewardship. How do you ensure that in the long term, what you're delivering today not only survives, but thrives? And you'll see a lot within the index as you go around that slide in terms of the thought process as to how we set that out and how we embed that within our teams, looking at this landscape first, this biodiversity first approach. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in practice? Well, put very simply, when you're looking at a large scale site and you are trying to maximize biodiversity, our approach to it is to consider first the core biodiversity nodes that are going to exist around the site, which are the heavy landscape features that are going to be brought forward. And there you can see there are a range of size and scale, from allotments and orchards and landscape buffers right the way up to country parks and informal parks as you move around the site. You're then looking at the connections. So these don't just sit in isolation and are unnetworked, because we have newts on one of our sites in Rugby at Halton, where actually the newt pathways throughout the site have then created phenomenal green connections between these various different nodes in the form of green infrastructure routes that flow through. And even the grey infrastructure in the context of the planting of the trees along the streets, and the blue infrastructure in terms of the waterways and the SUD systems, all form part of that hierarchy in practice. And then finally, the urban elements. You heard earlier the sort of question around green roofs and around brown roofs. The sort of how within the urban elements that are then going to come forward, can you then supercharge biodiversity further by delivering elements that then fit within that overall structure and can then be incorporated into the design codes that come forward for each of the phases. Next slide, please. That means you then end up with an integrated approach, which is greater than the sum of its parts. But this is before you drop any houses into the overall structure. So you are creating, next slide, the context of park living, whereby in essence, the housing is then inserted within the landscape, rather than starting with the housing and then trying to fit the landscape around it. And by doing that, both the people on the site who can appreciate the nature and the environment and everything around them, the health and well-being. You heard from Professor Newton earlier today about the impact that has on people's health and well-being. And we see this in terms of talking to the residents. And then also in terms of the landscape and why, and the ecologically diverse, biodiverse landscape that exists around it is thriving in the context of the interplay between the two. It is not a zero-sum gain. It is that everybody can benefit and everything can benefit if this is done properly. And it's why we invest heavily in this approach. And actually, it's why you're seeing more and more developers think through this and start to try and embrace this as an approach, because if you don't trust us for being ethical and putting biodiversity at our heart of our process, then actually it's economically quite rational as well to be investing in green infrastructure in the context of placemaking, because it delivers that sense of place and value. Next slide, please. So to take that into reality, these are a couple of images from our site at Halton. School walks, what lockdown has definitely generated, and the context of living on sites for more of the week as we emerge from lockdown, is that being able to walk your children to school through nature corridors is a joy, and is something that people actively are seeking out. Next slide, please. The creation of habitat ponds on site and the thriving of the newt population at Halton, all I can tell you is that they have been breeding like rabbits, and the growth of the newt population at Halton has been as much of a joy to behold as the population growth. Next slide. Dolman Orchard. It's a retention and enhancement of an existing orchard, but this was in October, September, October, when the community came together to harvest the apples from the orchard, and they have gone and made their own cider with the product of their labour, a community activity that brought people together based around a fundamental element of the site, a natural element of the site, which is then going on to create an economic benefit and something which is bespoke to Halton. Next slide, please. Wildlife corridors. This actually is an integration of existing landscape and an enhancement of existing landscape. So the trees to your left are old trees, the trees to the right are new trees, combination of hedgerows and additional planting, sud systems. This is a nature corridor which doesn't have footpaths and cycleways running through it, but which sits alongside those that do, and therefore is a highly biodiverse environment. Next slide, please. Village ponds. Again, placemaking, the idea of wildflower planting around the village pond, the sense of arrival with the housing in immediate proximity to it, it just shows that you really can deliver against the investment which is about placemaking, but achieve significant biodiversity net gain at the same time by following that sort of structured approach, so that ponds don't just become formal landscape, because you don't want a site that's delivered by Capability Brown, which is going to be cost a fortune to maintain. You want something which is natural and which appears natural from day one. Next slide, please. And playgrounds set in natural environments, so that actually when the kids get out and they're playing on wooden structures within a landscape. It's open, it's clear where they are, they're safe, they're secure, but also that landscape is acting, as I say, as one of those sort of core nodes that operate between various different elements of built form. And it's really lovely to see that element of appreciation that then goes into the play spaces and playing in nature that the kids on the site are able to enjoy. But actually these playgrounds are enjoyed by the wider areas as well. And one of the factors which, when you come to maintenance debates and so on and so forth in due course, is that they're not adopted spaces, because in our experience county councils have been very reluctant to adopt these spaces, so they are having to be privately maintained over the lifespan of the delivery and then the development going forward. And that's why you've got to be able to balance that sense of place creation with also a proper appreciation of what the ongoing management costs are going to be for these schemes, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail later. Next slide, please. But this is my last slide, and this is one of the points which I do want to major on, which is that it is absolutely vital to educate at all levels in terms of what is being done, why it's being done, the natural environments and the biodiverse environments that have been created. We do this via a number of different methods. So we have signage and wildlife walk signage as going around all the spaces to explain the different habitats and the different environments that we've created. We build this into the welcome packs for new residents, and in fact we then build it also into the newsletters that go out to the residents on a regular basis to be able to explain to them what's happening, the seasonal variations that are happening on site. We're also very proud that we work with Mike Dilger, a TV ecologist, and this is from the lady from the Warwickshire Wildlife Trust at Halton, to come on site and do wildlife workshops with the kids on the site. So they go out, they go and sort of, with a net and sort of, try and catch the little bugs and beasties that sort of are around the site, and then get explained as to what they are and why that is so important. And one stage further that we're seeking to go, and this comes up in the context of what Marion was talking about earlier, is how do you then interplay this with the schools? So, we believe heavily that the landscape around the schools should be able to provide an outdoor classroom for teaching. At our school at Wintringham, we actually have a garden in the centre of the school. We've invested at Priors Hall in delivering a new area of forest planting within the school grounds again, to be able to provide that classroom element, that outdoor classroom. And we are looking at and working with our ecologists and environmental and landscape teams to take the planning information that maybe 10, 15 people read if we're lucky overall in terms of the large scale site, but break it down into teaching resources so that can go into the schools that we are delivering on the site, so that they've got a detailed resource of what is around them in the immediate vicinity, which they can build into the curriculum. And so we would absolutely support this idea, that ecology and biodiversity, carbon and various other elements that are so intrinsic to the delivery of place in and around them are then fed into, in a digestible form, into the schools as well. And that's something we're working on, and we absolutely sort of endorse and encourage, because in 20 years' time, those children will be the ones that are then investing and deciding what they prioritize in terms of the management and evolution of place into which they have been brought up and maybe continue to live. And so it's important that they understand it as well. And anybody with kids will know that parents get heavily involved in school projects, so it's not a bad way of training the adults as well. That's me done. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, James, for that perspective from a master developer. And it was really interesting to hear about the essential role that green infrastructure and biodiversity are playing in that planning, but not just the planning. I think the stewardship that you mentioned there, I think people will be especially interested to hear about your park living approach, which I think is a really nice way of outlining that relationship with people in place, and the educational aspect that you put onto that as well. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions coming back in the chat, James. So many thanks for that. Let's move on. We're now going to hear our last speaker, Sarah Jane Chimwandira, who is going to talk about the local perspective of GI and biodiversity net gain. So Sarah is Chief Exec of Surrey Wildlife Trust, and having worked in nature conservation for over 20 years, Sarah Jane is passionate about bringing people and organisations from social, economic and environmental sectors together to deliver not only nature's recovery, but also more sustainable, multi-beneficial places. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Mel, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with you today to share how Surrey Wildlife Trust, working with partners, has been looking at taking biodiversity net gain as part of delivering a high quality green infrastructure into practical reality. So what do we actually need to do to start implementing this? As a wildlife trust, we are one of a network of 46 across the UK, and we're focused on how to achieve 30% of land and sea protected and managed for nature by 2030. Next slide, please. It has been mentioned in a variety of different ways already, but it's worth reiterating because of the urgency that we have at the moment, that we're in the midst of 4 different crises, all coming to a critical point at the same time. We know that over 1 million species globally are threatened, and this is not something that is just a concern to the conservation world, but increasingly is recognised within the business community as well, through initiatives such as Business with Nature. The risks inherent in this crisis were highlighted recently by the insurance company Swiss Re, who have identified that 1 in 5 countries globally are at risk of ecosystem collapse. And we know that across the UK, we are seeing ongoing trend of declining biodiversity. In a county like Surrey, our recent State of Nature report shows the same trend, with a third of our species lost or in decline. We're also starting to experience the impacts of climate change, with an increase in the severity and frequency of events such as wildfires and flooding. The wildfire you can see there was one of our national nature reserves last year and required the evacuation of local residents and to have the fire department on site for over a week in order to deal with it. We've also heard over the last 18 months how important nature has been to people's health and well-being, with over 38% of adults identifying that time in nature was the most important part of their day during lockdown. Next slide, please. However, the situation does provide us with a greater opportunity than we have ever had before to recognise the interdependence of our natural, social and economic systems and to deliver solutions to these crises. There is a significant opportunity presented as part of a green recovery, delivering nature-based solutions, but at the same time providing jobs and business resilience as well. Over the last 10 years in Surrey, we have been developing the natural capital approach. And you can see here, recognising that natural assets provide us with a range of essential services. But we also recognise that currently the stock of these assets is in decline. We must reverse that decline and increase our natural assets in both urban and rural contexts. And green infrastructure is a key aspect of doing this. Biodiversity net gain is an important mechanism for delivering such investment. Next slide, please. The policy and regulatory environment that we have must provide a strong and ambitious framework within which collaboration is actively encouraged. The Ecosystem Markets Task Force report over 8 years ago recognised the scale of the opportunity in developing a green economy. We have not yet realised this opportunity, and it's imperative that we start to implement this approach. Next slide, please. The IUCN has recently provided a framework which guides the delivery of nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions contain within them the highlight of biodiversity net gain as a key element in achieving the ecosystem integrity that we need. Our approach in Surrey is focused on how a nature recovery network can be delivered through this approach as one element of implementation. Next slide, please. Whether we are delivering sustainable urban drainage solutions, such as rain gardens, which also increase biodiversity, or urban greening opportunities through living walls, roofs, and my particular favourite, lampposts, creating pollinator pit stops, nature-based solutions often provide the most cost-effective way in which to deliver greater resilience through our urban and countryside areas. Next slide, please. So how will we deliver a nature recovery network in Surrey? We know in Surrey, because we did some scoping work over 7 years ago now, what the scale of the opportunity for a biodiversity offsetting approach is. We identified significant opportunity to draw additional funding in through the proposed development over a 5-year period, as you can see there. And not only short-term funding, but also long-term funding, which is very important for delivering nature outcomes. Short-term decision-making doesn't deliver the best outcomes for nature. The work that we did then has now matured into the biodiversity net gain principle, and I'd like to just cover a couple of case studies quickly that we've developed. One of the earliest examples that we had in Surrey was at Priest Hill, just south of Greater London in Epsom and Newell. Next slide, please. This site, which originally was owned by the Greater London Authority, was comprised of abandoned playing fields and attracted significant antisocial use, was of no benefit to the local community. By working in partnership with the developer, the local planning authority, the local community and Surrey Wildlife Trust, we were able to deliver a really fantastic solution here. Next slide, please. As you can see, the development was achieved, but it also created an 80-acre nature reserve for the local community, as well as an endowment to provide funding for the management of the site long term. This is now a fantastic green infrastructure asset for the local community. It regularly has large numbers of small blue butterfly, skylarks singing overhead, and is very well used by local residents. There has been a doubling of the biodiversity value of the site and a very engaged group of volunteers caring for it. However, this solution relied heavily on the commitment and vision of a small number of individuals. A mandatory biodiversity net gain approach is essential to allow this type of outcome to be delivered systematically. Next slide, please. Our second case study more recently has come about as part of implementing the Surrey Natural Capital Investment Plan, which we published in 2018. Working with one of our 2 local enterprise partnerships in Surrey, Coast Capital, we were able to develop a pilot natural capital investment project based around one of our biodiversity opportunity areas called Holmesdale. This landscape is a 1,400 hectare in size landscape. And for those of you who might have other things on your mind at the moment, bigger than 1,400 football pitches, and it's situated in East Surrey. It has a mix of agricultural land, nature reserves, mineral workings, and a landfill site, and it is an important part of our nature recovery network. We received an investment of just over £400,000 from Coast Capital to support investment in a range of natural assets, including the provision of a 20-foot San Martin bank, woodland management work, and training opportunities for young people in hedge laying, one of our dying arts. Next slide, please. In addition, the funding support enabled us to deliver a natural capital account for the Coast Capital area, identifying the value of the stock of natural assets at over 20 billion. Also demonstrating, as is often the case with natural capital accounts, that a significant proportion of the benefits arising from those natural assets, over 19 billion, are actually benefits to the public through health, recreation, carbon storage, and air quality improvements. Part of the work that we did with the funding from our LEP partner included a baseline assessment of the number of biodiversity units currently present within this landscape. Working with partners to identify the long-term vision and the improvements required to deliver a nature recovery network, we were also able to determine the number of available biodiversity units, creating a habitat bank of biodiversity credits. The funding also supported more detailed financial modelling with Finance Earth to understand how biodiversity net gain can be applied in practice, understanding how is the market going to start working. Next slide, please. In this case, what you can see here is the Holmesdale Biodiversity Opportunity Area with the range of services that it provides. The areas in red are Wildlife Trust nature reserves. And what we were able to determine was that an investment would provide a return with a 15-to-1 benefit to cost ratio over a period of 60 years in terms of delivering the suite of ecosystem service benefits shown here. In addition, and really importantly, it also identified the opportunity to create approximately 18 full-time equivalent jobs. Key aspects of this approach are that we are working to a 20% biodiversity net gain minimum in Surrey, and we're asking those that we work with to do the same. The other key learning from this work is the need for all landowners, whether in the private, public or third sector, to be preparing now by having baseline biodiversity net gain surveys carried out. It is absolutely essential, if biodiversity net gain is going to work, that we have a robust project pipeline in place to ensure that supply can meet demand once the Environment Bill has been passed. Next slide, please. So what we're doing in Surrey now is taking this approach a little bit further to a strategic level. What you can see here is one of the focus areas for nature recovery in Surrey, the North Downs. It is a high-profile, highly visited landscape within the Surrey Hills area of outstanding natural beauty. We have been mapping the potential biodiversity net gain projects within this area and have identified over 80 individual habitat restoration and creation projects covering a total of approximately 400 hectares. If we had the next slide, please. Recently, we have had a strategic opposition opportunity arising within one of the site registers that we have created across this landscape. Next slide, please. And you can see here that the site bounded in red that we are currently in the process of purchasing through a combination of a major donor, the Wildlife Trust, and the local community coming together to generate funds. A significant amount of funding was raised to support the purchase of the land. But it's not just about acquiring the land, it's about the long-term management and maintenance. And so this is an ideal candidate for a biodiversity net gain approach, delivering a key part of our nature recovery network, enhancing and restoring chalk grassland to improve ecosystem integrity, but also providing additional green space for the local community. And if we could move on to the next slide, please. Just to illustrate how this strategic approach to biodiversity net gain is helping us support the delivery of the nature recovery network, what you can see here now is a map of the North Downs area in 2019 showing connectivity for species through the landscape, illustrated with green areas where the area is connected and permeable to species, and red areas where there are barriers to species being able to move through the landscape. If we look ahead to 2050, and the model which assumes all 80 of the biodiversity net gain projects are delivered, we can see how the connectedness of the landscape has improved. Could we just move forward to the 2050 slide, please, and then back to 2019, and then forward again. So hopefully you can see there, particularly on the south scarp of the slope, how connectivity for species is increased as we deliver those projects. And on to the next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, working collaboratively is essential to the approach we're implementing. We are proactively working with colleagues in the Developers Forum that we have in Surrey, with our local authority partners, in order to share knowledge, best practice, and support the skills development required. Next slide, please. This is also supported by the development of standards such as Building with Nature Standards Framework, developed by a number of partners, including wildlife trusts, highlighting 12 key areas that are required to achieve high quality green infrastructure. And the next slide, please. So what are the next steps for us? Well, we will be continuing to work with local stakeholders in developing a strategic approach to delivering biodiversity net gain. This is key to achieving our nature recovery network. It's important that we build both the capacity to deliver high quality green infrastructure through this approach, as well as ensure that there is a robust project pipeline. We're shortly embarking on a 12-week programme of engagement with landowners and communities across Surrey to accelerate the development of the supply side of projects, as well as provide support and guidance to any landowners who want to realise the opportunity in delivering nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. I genuinely believe that a healthy, well-managed natural environment is fundamental to our health, well-being and economy, and that we have the opportunity now to actually achieve the change that's required. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And very interesting to hear about the approach in Surrey and the focus on maximising the gains by stimulating the market and the projects right now. I'm going to thank you all speakers and ask if you can turn your mics and cameras back on so we can slip into the Q&A session. But before we do that, just wanted to point everybody to the polls that we've launched now. If you click on the right-hand side, the second tab along, polls, there's a couple of questions there, or at least one question there, that it would be really useful if you could answer. And while you're doing that, I'm going to take the prerogative of asking a question for myself whilst we pick out the questions from the Q&A. So a key point that's come across from both the earlier session and this session actually is that through appropriate design and implementation, green infrastructure can facilitate the achievement of biodiversity net gain. And similarly, biodiversity net gain can be an effective investment mechanism and a vehicle for delivering green infrastructure. So question to the panel members, what kinds of green infrastructure and biodiversity net gain work best together in this symbiotic manner? So I'll start with you, Nick. Any quick thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. And I think on the both Sarah and James's presentation in particular highlighted some of the kind of types of green infrastructure that can work really well. I think that the key thing for us to be bearing in mind is we're used with green infrastructure to be thinking about the kind of multifunctional benefits it can provide. And it's making sure that we just factor nature and the kind of nature that's most relevant to that place into that equation. So Sarah was talking about chalk grass and fantastic opportunities in Surrey to do that. But if you're 200 miles away and you're designing green infrastructure using a kind of chalk grass and species mix, well, your species that are going to benefit are 200 miles away from your development site. So it's just really thinking about the nature that's most relevant to that place. And as James was talking about with Great Crested Newts, just integrating that into the scheme design. And you'll find through the metric, etc., that the green infrastructure features are there. It's just making sure that actually how you take those forward, the way you plant, the kind of species compositions are of benefit to the kind of that particular local area.
Thanks, Nick. Did anyone else want to come in there? Krista, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's. I think there were some comments previously, actually. I think in the first discussion around, kind of incorporation of SUDs and sustainable urban drainage as part of requirements, and I think, well-designed SUD schemes can contribute towards biodiversity net gain and vice versa. And, some habitats can and do provide carbon benefits as well. So when you're thinking about delivering net gain, whether that's on or off-site, consider how you can do it whilst delivering wilder benefits. For example, if there's a SUDs requirements, incorporate a SUD scheme that has value to wildlife, which will allow you to include it in the metric calculation. I think, again, kind of Nick and the team will be launching the metric 3 tomorrow. And again, when you actually kind of go through the metric, there's lots of opportunities to actually look at how you can consider those wider benefits. And I think, it's a great tool in terms of the prompts there that actually kind of get you thinking right at the early design stage of how you can consider those wider benefits and not just kind of think in terms of a tunnel vision of, right, I've got to deliver this net gain achievement here. It actually allows you right at the early stage to really kind of plan in all those different considerations, which I think, is kind of will really benefit, kind of delivery in the long term.
Thank you. Did anybody else want to come in there?
Can I just add? I was going to say, Melanie, sorry, Sarah, after you.
No worries. I was just going to say, actually, thank you, James. I think one of the really important things about the metric is that it's going to provide us with greater transparency around some of the trade-offs that we have to make when we're making decisions around implementing, whether it's biodiversity net gain, whether it's a nature recovery network, or whether it's development. Because it doesn't matter what arena you're operating in, you always have to make trade-offs. And I think that's something that we know and accept. And I think transparency in what those trade-offs are really important. To give you an example, in Surrey, we are one of the most important counties for lowland heathland. So actually a pressure to plant more trees on our lowland heathland habitats is not something that we would want to encourage. So it's about making sure that we understand what those trade-offs are and we have sight of them.
Thank you, Sarah. James.
I was going to just add, actually, that the other thing that we always start with is the context of pathways beyond the red line as well, and initiatives beyond the red line. So you and I think one of the questions in the chat brought this up, which is that you can't look at these sites just solely within the red line. You have to look at how they become but both a pathway for nature across sites, which may have not existed previously because of their historic use or because that was interrupted, but also the way in which they can supercharge those existing sort of initiatives in and around the site as well. So that sort of trade-off and that sort of design thought process has to incorporate much wider networks than the red line itself can even accommodate, even operating at the sort of scale that Sarah and I were talking about.
Thank you, and that segues very nicely into the first question on the Q&A that I'm going to raise here. So it is about the locality of placing GI and BNG. Sorry to slip to those acronyms, but they're quite a mouthful themselves. Will there be targets that favour on-site and off-site credits to prevent green infrastructure close to disadvantaged communities losing out to the more remote and high biodiversity value sites that might benefit from statutory credits? Nick, I'm going to post that one to you because I know that there are some values in the metric that will target in some respects. Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. So as I mentioned, the kind of policy has that kind of spatial hierarchy in it, but then as you mentioned, the metric does as well. So depending on where you are delivering your net gains, the metric takes into account how far away you've gone from the development site, and it's trying very much to try and keep the delivery close to that development, so that A, you don't create ecological deserts, but B, and more importantly, that local people, local communities do get an opportunity to benefit from that additional kind of opportunity to access with nature. So for most habitats, if you go outside of your local authority area or outside the wider natural character area, there are some negative multipliers that begin to come into play. It's slightly different at the coast, but basically it doesn't prevent you from, if you're a project in London, delivering your net gain somewhere else in the country. But as a developer, you'd need to do much more. The incentive is to try and keep benefits local. So Sarah, as lovely as Surrey is, I live in Lewisham. I'd quite like to see benefits in Lewisham, not Surrey. So that's how it's kind of designed to work.
Does anybody else want to come in on that, Sarah?
I will, if I may. Actually, really interesting, because when the previous approach, the biodiversity offsetting approach, about sort of 10 years ago was put forward, I went to so many meetings where the conversation was, well, it's okay, we're going to offset, so we'll build in Surrey and we'll offset in Scotland. And actually, for us, the geographic proximity discussion has been a very pertinent one, because obviously development pressure in a county like Surrey is really significant. It's a very small county. I think one of the solutions to that, apart from making sure that you adhere to the mitigation hierarchy, is actually involving local communities and local landowners in identifying the opportunities where you can apply biodiversity net gains. That's one of the reasons why we're starting this programme of engagement with landowners across Surrey, because what will hold up the system is if developers need to put a development forward, but they cannot find the appropriate net gain site within the geographic proximity that they need. So that's why I feel so strongly, and I'm saying to every landowner at the moment, get your baseline net gain surveys done now, so that the supply doesn't hold up the demand, because we're already starting to feel, even though it's not come into law yet, that demand is building already. So we really need to get the supply in place.
Thanks, Sarah. Krista.
Yeah, just building on that, really. I mean, yeah, we've got to move from this kind of reactive approach to a proactive approach. And that's, traditionally, how we've kind of dealt with things, it has been kind of quite reactive in terms of, a development comes along, and actually in terms of biodiversity net gain, or whether it's just, kind of trying to seek improvements there. Actually, in terms of having those sites is absolutely fundamental. So yeah, again, we're kind of similarly looking at a need and supply assessment to say, well, actually, what's the need here in terms of, and again, mitigation hierarchy is absolutely fundamental to this. Should be doing this on site, but if we can't, where can we find that, kind of the best site that's nearest to that development, and then kind of work your way from that. And I think from our point of view, actually understanding, and local authorities understanding, that in terms of what the future demand is, in terms of, let's say, their 5-year pipeline of development, well, actually, what is the forecasted demand in terms of on-site, but also off-site, and then start kind of looking, well, actually, in terms of those offset sites, again, it's not just by, particularly with the metric, is, it's not just about saying a metric for, in terms of one biodiversity unit for one other biodiversity unit. It's got to be like for like or better. And I think that's the key thing here in terms of understanding that spatial, kind of provision of sites, that actually, kind of providing that kind of meeting that need is absolutely essential, really. So, having that kind of those discussions with landowners to actually, but also with local authorities, there are opportunities here for local authorities to bring forward sites, and particularly, kind of working with those authorities that, can understand that opportunity and actually kind of think, well, actually, there is an opportunity here to actually kind of help meet this need, really. And I think, again, it's just kind of having that kind of understanding of the need and presenting that, kind of within your own local authorities to kind of start getting leaders and officers, kind of aware of that opportunity.
Thank you. Can I take us to another question? One here about funding and maintenance funds. So, Krista, you talked about raising funds for development for biodiversity net gain. This looks like a time-limited funding. What is the long-term funding to maintain the gains made in biodiversity? And several people have asked about that. Is it a one-off thing, or will there be funds set up for managing this in perpetuity or for 30 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Nick's kind of already quite rightly presented here, that there is in terms of those additional monies that come forward from developers, they will need to cover that 30-year cycle in terms of that maintenance, and that will need to be addressed as part of the agreements that go in place in terms of those monies. That it isn't just kind of one-off payment, that actually they'll need to have various agreements put in place that actually monitors that site and make sure that actually it does deliver in terms of what it set out to do. And I think we need to have that. And again, I think in the chat before, particularly around those kind of resources, not only in terms of maintenance for those developers or landowners kind of putting those kind of plans in place, but also local authorities. How do we kind of ensure that local authorities have the additional resources in place to be able to work with those landowners to monitor that, but also keep a register of sites? And again, there's further detail to be, kind of looked at in terms of that, in terms of how we deliver it. But that's a crucial one, really, in terms of having that up-to-date list of and register of sites that we know of the various different, kind of net gain sites that are being delivered. And again, the additional burdens that I think we've seen in the chat there that DEFRA are proposing will help, kind of address that in the kind of in the immediate term. Nick, I don't know whether you want to add to that.
Just briefly, just in the point that also there's opportunities to bring other funding streams into play as well. So add the opportunity to link net gain monies with potentially other sources of funding around carbon or whatever. But then also be thinking about when you are delivering on site as well. Obviously, now thinking about how the long-term management and maintenance of that is going to work. So James was talking about the long-term relationship you have with some of the sites there, and be interested in your thoughts on that kind of on-site kind of longer-term maintenance as well.
Thank you. Can I take us on to another question?
Yeah,
and I'm going to pose this one to you, James. Sorry, was somebody?
Okay.
Oh, good, but it was.
No, I was coming on the back of Nick's question about management, but I'll happily take yours, man.
You can weave them together. So the question was around the examples you gave, and does such extensive green infrastructure result in lower provision of other key elements such as affordable housing? So how might that play off in probably the more economic side of the discussion there? I'll pose that one to you, James.
So let me start with. Yeah, that's fine. Let me start with Nick's challenge. I mean, first, if I may, which is that management starts with design. So you've got to be thinking about the management of a place long term when you are thinking about designing it. So you cannot get, and I used capability Brown earlier, you can't get capability Brown in and the idea that you will end up with the Trevi fountains or whatever it is. You've got to be able to produce landscape that's capable of long-term and efficient management. And there are things about that, which is that we've discovered as we've gone, extensive wildflower planting in areas of open space is something that is accepted by residents as being something that's attractive, provided actually there's a small area of mown lawn to the street edge, which then looks like the place is being properly managed and that is intentional. Now, that's small-scale elements that actively reduce ongoing management costs, but which overall increase biodiversity. Going to your question, Melanie, in terms of the sort of the wide range of costs and demands on any large-scale development, you're always balancing a whole series of factors when you're looking at delivery. Transport costs, education costs, they far outweigh landscape costs, and yet they are sort of at the forefront of most historic planning discussions, I would say, in terms of particularly transport. But it's great to see that actually the natural environment and biodiversity are now a fundamental part of those debates and discussions. And our view is actually done properly, landscape, you've heard people talk about in terms of the carbon agenda, the biodiversity agenda, the amenity agenda, the health and well-being agenda. It plays into so many different elements of great placemaking that actually the investment in it should pay for itself because it sort of underpins so much of that context of park living, which is what I was trying to sort of get at previously. So we don't see this as a trade-off in relation to affordable housing, but obviously within any large-scale development, there are a whole series of factors and costs at play, which it comes down to local people and local politicians all expressing priorities as to which they would want to see in any assessment prioritised over anything else.
Thank you. We've got just about a minute or so left, but there was one question I wanted to pose to Sarah and Krista for a one-liner top tip. The Greater Manchester approach shows the importance of buy-in from leadership. Not all of us have leaders as forward-thinking as Burnham. What tips would the panel give for securing buy-in from leadership? So I'm afraid it's going to have to be a one-liner each as a take-home. Sarah, you go first.
Yeah, no worries. I think that you will find there are leaders in all sorts of sectors across your area and region, and what you need to do is bring them together and give them the opportunity to actually make the difference.
Thank you. Krista?
Yeah, so building on that, particularly with your local nature partnership, you know, there's a huge abundance of experience there, and also utilising the evidence that you've got. And we'll hear more later on about, you know, evidence handbook and everything that actually we use that evidence to demonstrate what we've got and the importance of that really in terms of our natural environment.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there because we're out of time. We've had a lot of questions, so thank you all. We couldn't possibly get through them all, but we will try to do so in due course. So many thanks to our 4 excellent speakers here, Nick White, Krista Patrick, James Scott and Sarah Jane Chimwandira. I think they've really given us some food for thought about how we can achieve multiple benefits for nature and people and raise some interesting challenges and solutions as to how we're going to need to work together over the next coming years. So thank you for that. The final webinar today will start at 2 until 3:30, and the topic is an introduction to the Green Infrastructure Standards Framework. But between now and then, I also encourage you to network with each other by clicking on networking on the left-hand side, and the system will place you in a pair with another delegate for a few minutes and then swap you to meet someone else. So it is Speed GI. So many thanks for your participation, and we look forward to making this happen on the ground. Thank you all.
Brilliant, thanks.
Bye.